Great, good morning. I want to thank SAGES and certainly the moderators here, Tiffany Cox and Ellen Ochranek, for inviting me to give this presentation, as well as it's quite an honor to follow Dr. Anvari, because I've been following his really his career and his efforts with all this telesurgery and what he just presented to you. I think it's really fascinating. So I certainly am not up here to tell that similar tale. I think what's important now is to see for us, I can't speak for the entire military, so don't get that wrong. I am wearing a uniform up here, but let me show you my disclosures. This next.
If you're on a PC, it's the other clicker. Let's see. I think it's yeah, this way.
So next. Okay, I'll just go through my disclosures. So I don't have any financial disclosures, and these are not the views of the military. These are the views of me as an academic surgeon, and I'm based out of Navy Medical Center San Diego. I'm a general surgeon and do a lot of minimally invasive surgery, do a lot of robotic surgery. So I've had a lot of interest in robotics, but we've interacted with Intuitive quite a bit over the years, and there's a real resistance to move commercially into telesurgery. So what we like to talk about, what I'd like to talk about is more telehealth and where are we in 2018, where are we going forward with maximizing telehealth? Because there's a lot we can do, of course, that's short of telesurgery. Telesurgery is the holy grail. It's awesome to be able to do a distance and actually interact and do surgery. Concept's been proven, but it takes an enormous amount to do that. So telehealth, telementoring, telepresence, and it could be asynchronous, synchronous. So that's what I want to focus on. And it's interesting to look back at a lot of advances, again, from a military perspective, advances through the different wars we've had. As we all know, big war campaigns, advanced Navy, military medicine, military surgery. And just to kind of go through that briefly, in World War I, there was a huge advancement in the handling of femur fractures. Okay, World War II, freeze-dried plasma, delayed closure of wounds. This is all new and really developed. Korea, you know about the MASH units in helicopter transport. That was all very new and really transformed medevac and patient care. That was enhanced further with the Vietnam War. And then, of course, well, I don't know if the audience, I shouldn't say of course, these last 15 years, there's been major advances in combat trauma, and they're being translated into the civilian sector. That's often what happens is the military surgeons make advances during combat, and it gets translated into civilian care as well. What do we think is next? I think it's arguable to say that telehealth is going to be really the current military campaign era. So there's all these little hotspots, as we call them, and telehealth. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about as part of this talk. But in terms of telehealth, you know, where is it? So we start with now. What have we been seeing is happening in the civilian sector? How can we tap into and really make this an advance for military medicine? Keeping in mind, military medicine has some real advances because we're basically an international healthcare system, and licensing is not per state. You just need to be licensed in a state. And so that's very helpful. And then, of course, insurance is covered. So a lot of these real obstacles for the civilian sector to branch out and really make this into a concerted effort, we're finding that now this idea of virtual health, telehealth is really growing, a lot of support. So we know with medical patients, you can do some telecritical care and really influence some acute stroke or myocardial infarction, maybe at a hospital where or a place where providers aren't able to diagnose these disorders initially, quickly. Surgical patients, I'll show some literature about rural trauma, burn trauma, wound care follow-up. So there's some telehealth, telemedicine that can influence patient care. And again, in a big health system like ours, that can make a big difference. So there's just kind of building up. We watched this literature and realized that telemedicine really is growing. This is just a survey, but found that in 2012 that a majority of burn centers or a number of burn centers were using telemedicine, and that was actually improving patient care. Moving forward with the cost effectiveness, you see that decreased air transport. Some of these logical conclusions you would think if you have expertise dialing in and helping a healthcare team where they don't have that expertise, that's going to help. That's going to increase patient care, decrease patient transfers, and increase patient satisfaction. And application in trauma care, you can see that as well. The rural trauma setting is similar to, for us, what we call like a Role 2 or a hospital overseas, where you don't have all the resources, you don't have the subspecialists, and so we watch some of this rural surgery, rural trauma care literature, and realize that that applies to, how do we apply that to our military support overseas? More recently, there's a review in, this is just 2016, and a systematic review of the literature looking at the application of telemedicine for surgical care. And there's a whole list of different subspecialties here and a whole list of different technology being used. So you can see there's going to be a lot of need for organization as to how you fine-tune that and make it into an actual functional concept that can be used and supported and more reliable. So you see patient satisfaction, and you're going to have save in distance travel, time saved, cost saved. These are not controversial. These are logical conclusions, but you always need literature to kind of build up to what an effort to argue for the military to put in to really allocate lots of funds and resources, which is what we're finding, and I'm going to talk about that. So again, just to summarize this portion, see that you can conserve trauma resources, decrease unnecessary transfers, and cost savings. There's a lot of logical benefits. So what is happening at our center, and this is a real current, we're in the real flux of a lot of support, monetary support, personnel support, actual real estate in our hospital. We're really expanding this telecritical care. Now, I'm not a critical care surgeon, but I work with the virtual health and in the telesurgery or the telementoring for surgery patients aspect of it. And really what they're looking at is increasing readiness, delivering value. We look at jointness, and this is out of the Navy Medical Center, San Diego, virtual health department, basically. And if you see on the bottom, those are different bases. So we're in Southern California, and then we've started to branch out. So Camp Pendleton is just up the road. It's about an hour and a half up the road. That's proof of concept. And they have an ICU. It's low volume. They don't always have critical care staff to support it. And then we, from Balboa, started to offer 24/7 support. And they do telecritical care rounds. And they really were able to keep patients within the system, decrease transfers, and improve the patient care. And then they branched it out to Camp Lejeune, which is East Coast, Jacksonville, East Coast, so quite a distance, a few thousand miles away. And they've actually started to go overseas as well for the critical care aspect. So that's really where the strength has initially, there's a lot of bang for your buck. There's a lot that can be done just through this workstation, this hub. So this hub is what we have currently. And again, I think with this talk, what I wanted to deliver more is what is realistic in 2018 and maybe the next 5 years. Where do we see patient care evolving that literally will evolve? It's happening now. It's going to change. So we have this center. This is the initial model. There's 3 of these stations, and I'm sure everyone's seen these stations. It's not a new kind of concept, but unless you're sitting there, you see the patient, you see the CT scans, you have the electronic medical record, you can look up other information. And so I've actually used this just between those 2 places, Balboa, so that's San Diego and Camp Pendleton. So I'll operate at Camp Pendleton, then I'll do rounds with my patients through this system. It's very satisfying. patients seem to look. It's just a very natural. If you have an option for it, patients seem more savvy with the technology and aren't put off by that distance. So again, this is basically the room has to be where the patient is. They obviously need a system with a camera and a microphone, and they have that at Camp Pendleton. So it's a very good test bed for us to prove our concepts and then build support from the military. And the virtual health group at Balboa are able to put together a quality improvement program where they publish this in military medicine. They've presented this as well, but basically they were able to provide 24/7 support of a critical care unit. That makes a big difference to the Camp Pendleton, the community hospital, and they were able to decrease transfers and really prove the proof of concept to continue moving forward. So that's an easy win, and then they're expanding to overseas, and I'll have some slides. Yeah, so here. So sure, we can help in CONUS. That's in the United States. That's important for sure. And we have rural hospitals, like the civilian sector has rural hospitals. It's the same insurance, no licensing issues. Could be even the same patients. So we're able to expand. What really is more cutting edge for us is to go overseas to a combat zone and dial in to the hospitals overseas and offer that same service. So that's done. That's been done. That's new. That's brand new. But that's really where we see as a military effort, that's really cutting edge for us, is how do we expand our expertise beyond our borders and overseas. So Guam, other hospitals overseas, as I mentioned. So Role 3 means it's basically a major hospital, has subspecialties, has a CT scanner, has an ICU. A Role 2 is literally just a small team with a surgeon, maybe some critical care holding capabilities. That's where the real advantage is for us, again, for a military effort, is to be able to dial in to the Role 2. That's where I've deployed. I'm general surgeon in the middle of nowhere, and you get some really sick patients. To have somebody dial in and help you is really key. So that's the real kind of current effort. And then shipboard. So shipboard is just a real challenge. Basically, when we go on a ship, the connectivity just goes back about 10 years, really. You might get some emails. You're not going to do any, asynchronous interaction. Certainly you can do that. But anything really live that requires a lot of bandwidth, it's very limiting. So that's a floating island. That's obviously a floating rural surgery type of hospital in the middle of nowhere. Even worse, because you're not in any particular country. There's no real evacuation process. So if we can offer service there, that's more, again, bandwidth is a big issue, and that has to do with really security issues is a big aspect of it. So that's kind of beyond, not currently, but it's an effort. So telehealth, you can use it in different subspecialties, really decrease adverse events. And then how do we advance this to the battlefield? So that's the Role 2, or even what we call a Role 1, or even point of injury. So that's patient care is point of injury. Somebody's shot or an IED goes off, that's point of injury. Then they get transferred by a medic to a Role 1, which is just like, it's just a receiving area. It's an ER, basically, resuscitated bay. And then they go to Role 2 or 3, or they might skip some of those steps. But nonetheless, how do we get this technology, this critical care, even more to the cutting edge of the point of injury? I think that currently for the military is a real here and now. There's technology coming along. If you're land-based, you usually have a lot better connectivity than you're ship-based. So there's some different new programs. There's the Advisor. This is a military program. Advisor program, we call it Advanced Virtual Support for Operational Forces. So this is a newer effort, and it's along the same kind of concepts where a medic can dial in, and there'll be some support that can offer some expertise. They may be able to send back some images, and let me see if I have, this is a proof of concept, so I thought I would just show more of a, instead of the proof of concept, I'll talk about an actual real world case, and this is just a year ago, or at least June 2017, where there's a special operations medic who is overseas. So this definitely happens for us. Overseas, you have a medic, so not a critical care team, not a surgery team, roll over, and now you have one of your service members it's injured, and it requires a lot of expertise. So in this particular case, there was no medevac, and they were able to dial in through this advisor system, which is similar to the virtual health system I was talking about. And our critical care doctor, Dr. Davis, who's the head of our virtual health, real pioneer with this concept. He recruited trauma care, and they were able to look at the wound, talk about management. And you think of a medic doesn't know how to handle some of these complex wounds. There's plenty of opportunity to have expertise dial in and help out these medics, or role twos, I was saying. So that's an obvious advantage. We just have to work with security. Security of the comms, and this is how the wound was healed. And you have a little desiccation there, but the point is that it helped through a complex wound. That's just an example. You can think of many different examples. So, but there are limitations. There's a difference in the surge capacity. That means when we actually have a war effort going on, we get a lot of resources, and then it kind of dies down. How do we keep that even? The technology is hit or miss. Certainly, we're working on that. Certainly on ships, it's a black area for us. And the advisor system, I mentioned to it, but it doesn't have dedicated staff, and the fidelity is lower, so it could definitely be improved. When we look at the demand for bandwidth, of course, that's a big limitation. If you're just doing email, no big deal. You send an email to a ship, maybe the next day somebody looks at it and talks about what medications they can use for some kind of cellulitis or something. But if it's anything more complicated as you move forward, quality video, and of course a live video, anything like telesurgery, that's just on a shipboard. That's gosh, I don't know, 20 years away. It's really tough to even really grasp. But we follow it. We have interest in it, but we just don't see how it's here and now. We see more what's here and now is telepresence, telementoring, and again this telehealth concept. How do we actually make that current? So what are the tools we do to help out with the operational community? So this is a joining of this concept of advisor and telecritical care VTC consultation. So that NMCSD is our center. So this is something that's in the planning. So again, this is not currently now, but definitely a lot of support. This is going to happen where BAMC is the Army hospital. So if you have Navy and Army hospitals working together, covering critical care throughout the bunch of hospitals, you can see some of the dates are in the future too. So it's really pretty new and moving forward. So that's a big advantage for us. That's advancing the critical care support for outlying hospitals. That's what that was. And then operational. A couple more slides here. So this is a little busy slide, but we like this slide because it shows the conflicts that we've had and the nature of the conflicts. So as military medicine, military surgery, we look at that and realize just how drastically military efforts are changing, really changing from back in World War II, of course. That's a traditional ground campaign, Navy campaign. That's what a lot of movies are made about that, because that's kind of traditional understanding of warfare. But now it is very different, very different. You have a lot of little teams, like those medics I was saying, little teams going out supporting efforts, and they really need some of the critical. We can't set up a big hospital, even Afghanistan, Iraq. In those locations, we do have hospitals, and we do have some critical care support, but it's not predicted that, no one really knows, but it's not really predicted that that's the likely in the future that we're going to take over a big landmass. We're likely to be kind of in little pockets here and there. So number of conflicts increases. You can't have surgeons everywhere, so you need to have support. And what support? I think telehealth. Telehealth is a way to at least expand the expertise beyond, instead of just in person, but to these other unpredictable spots. So the operational environment, these are the operational needs, so we're looking at that. The surgical expertise needs to be expanded. Prolonged field care is a big issue. So prolonged field care, that means that you have a patient overseas, ATV, maybe it's a rollover, it could be ID blast, who knows, and there's a medic or maybe a a Role 1 team take care of that patient, and they just don't have medevac. I mean, that's understandable. The weather's bad. It's not safe. You just don't have medevacs. They have to hold the patient. So that's when, if you could dial in and help out with managing a patient, that's obvious advantage. So this is a busy slide, but really, I don't want to go through all those words, but really look at obviously the world's a huge place, right? So virtual health can bridge that gap. That's the idea, bridge that gap, but also support operational units. They can't really predict where they're going to be, which is also the beauty of it. Versus if you're in Kandahar and you're in Iraq, okay, we know the hospital is, you try to get the patient to that place, and those critical care docs, trauma docs are available. But if a team is roaming, which can happen, and they're not near one of those places, and you don't really want to go to a host nation, that's the other thing, is we can go to host nation, sure, but that's operationally compromising. You don't know the quality of the hospitals. You need to have some kind of memorandum of understanding. It gets complicated. So if we can keep it internal to the U.S. or coalition forces, then that's preferred. And this is another way of showing the amount. So we do, most of the information will be asynchronous. You might have some teleconsultation, some phone calls, VTC. A lot of that can be supported, but when you get up to the real intraoperative telepresence in the OR, where you have an expert dialing for that critical moment, that is just a really wonderful capability to be able to offer, but it requires, it's not as often, so how many resources are you going to put towards that unlikely scenario, but when it does happen, it's super helpful. So usually we don't look at cost savings in the military when it comes to patient service members that are risking their lives for our nation overseas. It's not really a business model, it's a outcomes model. We look at how are you able to influence positively the patient surviving and potentially going back to the war. That's really the argument. So there's a lot of support, but what bandwidth, as I was talking about, can be an issue. I just want to go, I'm not sure if I'm running over time here, but so there's we've talked about telehealth, but there's also be augmented reality. That's another aspect that our department in virtual health is looking at. How do we tap into that? That's a real here and now option. So augmented reality technology, Artemis is, let me see if I show so there's different ways. You have wearable hardware, and there's a lot of information you can have available. This is like a fancy Google Glasses type of concept, but it takes a learning curve, and there's when does it fit in? It's expensive, so you have to, when does it fit in, and you have to play around with it. So kind of looking at this as the medic is seeing a patient. Gosh, if you're a trauma surgeon sitting back at home, you're safe. You're not under fire, so you can think more clearly, and you can dial into a medic that's running around seeing a patient on the battlefield. That's really the concept that we're trying to work towards. So there's a lot of efforts on that, and I think that's, again, telehealth, bringing that presence to the battlefield, helping out your less trained, well-trained, but less, recruiting your CMEs, your subject matter experts, to help with the battlefield. This is just a slide just to show that I think it really means something when you have an actual structural plan that's underway, that's supported in our hospital where there's limited resources. They're building this huge, it's going to be joint operational center where they have different teleconsultation, critical care stations, and we're talking about having like a surgical or a procedure room where you can walk somebody through a crike or through putting a central line in. You can think of how that could be helpful walking somebody through. So lots of options. And just a little teaser. So the U.S., this is where I'm going to end here, but so just to show that this is alive and well in the Navy, this telehealth, and that we have the Navy's support, is how do we apply this to operational? So the USNS Mercy, so that's a hospital ship, one of those big white hospital ships. It's deployed, it does humanitarian missions, and it goes around the Pacific. On that ship, they have these teleconsultation, telepresence stands that they're going to use on the ship There also is a intuitive, so the big robot company agreed, well, it was actually pretty complicated to have industry put their equipment on our ship, but nonetheless, after lots and lots and lots of conversations and legal discussions, they actually have a intuitive Da Vinci robot on the Mercy. So that's the first time that we're not suggesting that we're going to do telesurgery, like I was saying. That's not really, the bandwidth is a problem. It's really not, but we can do telepresence. So that's our intent, is we're going to do telepresence, telecritical care with patients on the ship, or a consultation, because they do humanitarian care. They might see dermatology is certainly a big one, where they see strange rashes or dermatologic issues, and they can dial in and actually interact with the patient like it were at Camp Pendleton, but this is going to be on a ship around the sea, in the ocean. So that's really exciting that they're evolving that. Again, there is a robot that's on the ship, which is a big deal. However, as I was mentioning, we really don't have the bandwidth. We've looked at it, and it's a real issue. So I'm not sure. It's hard to predict. It's hard to predict. We've been talking about that concept for a long time, but it's hard to predict when that would actually be reality. So that's the ship I was talking about, USNS Mercy. Pretty exciting for that regard. I just want to leave with a quote. The only thing worse than being blind is having sight but no vision. So continue to have vision, certainly big vision to push the envelope, advance subject matter expert out to the cutting edge, and that would be point of injury, roll twos. That would be a real advantage. So with that, I want to thank you for your time, and look forward to any questions.